not disturb, and you can turn do not disturb on.
Bingo. Thank you.
I had no idea.
Rebecca, you were like,
It doesn't always work. I do that, but then I end up having to close all the applications so that they don't bump in.
override.
Because inevitably there's some pinging and dinging no matter what I do with that do not disturb. But, great. Let's try it.
We're in.
We're in. Fabulous.
Excellent. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another PNP Live. My name is Bashan. I'm part of the event staff with Politics and Prose. Before we get started with our event, I just want to go over a couple quick items. The first is that at any time during this event, if you would like to ask a question of our authors, we would ask for you to place it into the Q&A box, which you can find if you move your cursor around towards the bottom of your screen. It is separate from the chat, just so that can help us facilitate the question and answer period. Also, at any time during this event, you'll be able to go to the chat section and find a link where you can purchase a copy of What's Your Story from the Politics and Prose website. We, of course, highly encourage you to do so, and thank you in advance for your patronage. That said, I have the pleasure of introducing a couple of, we have 3 authors, but 2 of them written the book we're here to discuss right now. In no particular order, first we have Ms. Rebecca Walker. Ms. Walker has contributed to the global conversation about race, gender, power, and the evolution of the human family for 3 decades. Since graduating from Yale, she has authored 7 best-selling books on subjects ranging from intergenerational feminism and multiracial identity to Black cool and ambivalent motherhood, and written dozens of articles on topics as varied as Barack Obama's masculinity, the work of visual artist Ana Mendieta, and the changing configuration of the American family. Rebecca has written, developed, and produced film and television projects with Warner Brothers, NBC, Amazon, HBO, and Paramount, and spoken at over 400 universities and corporate campuses internationally, including Harvard, Out and Equal, Museum of the African Diaspora, and TEDx Lund. When Rebecca was 21, she co-founded the Third Wave Fund, which makes grants to women and transgender youth working for social justice. She was named by Time magazine as one of the most influential leaders of her generation and continues to teach her masterclass, The Art of Memoir, at gorgeous and inspiring places around the world. The co-author for today's book is Miss Lily Diamond. Lily is a writer and advocate harnessing the power of digital media to democratize wellness and empower women through storytelling, accessible practices for inner and outer nourishment, and revolutionary acts of self-care within our earth and human communities. She is the creator of internationally beloved blog Kale and Caramel, and author of best-selling memoir cookbook Kale and Caramel, Recipes for Body, Heart, and Table, celebrated as one of the top cookbooks of 2017 by the New York Times, The Independent, Cooking Light, Mind, Body, Green, and more. They will be joined in conversation today by Ms. Jody Patterson. Jody is an author, activist, beauty explorer, and mother of 5. God bless you. She holds the position of chair of the Human Rights Campaign Foundation Board, our nation's largest LGBT organization. She has a globally recognized activist. She speaks on topics of radical parenting, identity, and gender. When her son announced at the age of 3, "Mama, I'm not a girl, I'm a boy," she set out to inform herself, shift her own biases, and change the way her community understood gender. She chronicled that journey in her memoir, The Bold World, a memoir of family and transformation, hailed by Alice Walker as marvelous. Cosmopolitan magazine filmed a mini documentary on her family in 2016, which has reached over 11 million views. Without any further ado, Lily Diamond, Rebecca Walker, and Ms. Jody Patterson.
Hello.
Hello, people out there that we can't see, but we are really happy to have with us for this next hour or so. Welcome.
Thank you all so much for spending a little bit of your Sunday with us. I know there's much that that your time is precious and that we all have a certain amount of screen and Zoom fatigue. And so it feels especially precious to have space to be with all of you today. This book that we're all here to talk about and celebrate, What's Your Story? A Journal for Everyday Evolution, is really about reclaiming one's story. And as a part of doing that, finding ways to interrogate the stories that we have brought with us to this moment, the stories that came with us from the whole span of our lives, and also the weight of lineage that came before us that informed so many of our stories. So when we talk about story, we're talking about many of the beliefs, the assumptions, the narratives that we have brought into this very moment, whether that's a story about, having Zoom fatigue, being tired, understanding ourselves, feeling isolated within the matrix of this new, world of COVID and relating to each other, or a story of feeling triumphant and hopeful and full of new possibility. So the book is broken up into chapters that help us to identify what each of those stories are that we're carrying with us, from being in our minds, our bodies, within our communities, with family. And in our conversation with you, we wanted to give a sense of how that transformation happens in relationship with people. And of course, that then radiates out into community. And those are each chapters within the book. And so as we start to interrogate these stories, one of the most powerful challenges that we encounter is that very act of reclamation becomes a kind of radical act when one story does not fit into the hegemonic norm. And so as kind of a baseline, I want to start our conversation today with looking at what happens when the norms that we live within, that we take for granted often, are questioned. And we are in conversation today with someone who has used the space of her family, herself, and the stories that she tells about motherhood to question those stories. So just wanted to begin by thanking Jody for being here with us today, for so openly sharing your work and your story. And I'll just say another word before I turn it over to Rebecca. But as I'm thinking a lot about the stories that we live within, particularly as they relate to identity and to gender, I thought this morning, as I was reflecting on all of this, so many of the stories that we take for granted are often deeply insidious. They are millennia long, deeply held stories of oppression that serve to uplift the voices and the bodies and the stories of a select few, and to really oppress countless others, often typically in the name of capitalism and white supremacy. And the stories of white supremacy and of colonization are also the stories of policing gender norms. They're the stories of, indigenous land and people being colonized by Eurocentric parties and then forced into gender compliance, often by law. And so where indigenous people around the world often wove stories of identity that totally transcended the gender binary, whiteness and religious conformity ensured that you could only be a man or a woman. You must enter into that binary and play the part. And so that leaves us today in a society where people who do not conform to that story, to that binary, are persecuted. And to tell a different story, a radical story, is incredibly, it's a form of resistance that is that requires tremendous courage. And so I'm really excited and honored to be in conversation with both Rebecca and with Jody, who have dedicated their entire lives to questioning this framework of the gender binary and really interrogating these stories. So I am excited to be here, and Rebecca, I'll turn it over to you now.
So obviously I see Jody's beautiful face here, and I want to make sure that she has at least one beat of radiation and presence before I launch into my thing. So Jody, will you just say hey before I transition?
You know, I'm dying to, because first of all, I want to congratulate you, Lily and Rebecca, on this book. It is, I just got it, and I pick it up and I'll open it up to a single page just randomly, and it's spot on. Marking it up already. So thank you for inviting me into this conversation. And this idea of story, writing story, thinking about story is so important, because there are so many. My mind had a certain story, my body had a certain story, my actions had a certain story. And until you start to think about them, you're kind of just spinning, unknowing. So this, when we can journal it and really articulate it, is what we need to be focusing on. So thank you for having me. I'm very excited to talk today.
We are thrilled. So for all of you who may have been following the events that we've been doing as we've been introducing the book to the community and to the world, most of them have been focused on us and the process of writing, and how important we feel it is to change our own stories and for others to change their stories, and how that's been really rooted in my personal practice of writing memoir for many years, and how helpful and healing and cathartic that process has been, and helpful for me in leaving behind old stories and making space for new stories. And also the book being rooted in the work that Lily and I have done for the last decade, within the context of both my masterclass, The Art of Memoir, and also developing a modality that sort of spun out of that, in which we've asked people very specific prompts that can help them to excavate what they are holding in their minds, the stories that they've been given, that they have been sort of lugging around forever, that may not be serving them. And that in the process of asking that question and excavating those stories, then make space for them to envision and imagine and create a new future. So while we've been doing a lot of talking about that, it occurred to us that there are some people in our lives and in our world who have done the work of rewriting their stories in very powerful, transformative, and inspiring ways. And I can think of no other person who has done that as brilliantly and powerfully and beautifully as Jody Patterson. So, you know, I have followed Jody since she was involved in creating Joe's Pub, and the amazing sort of energy in the 90s of a kind of explosion of Black culture and dynamism, through her work in the beauty industry of sort of claiming Black beauty, and really, you know, beauty of all kinds, and working in that world. But I really fell in love with Jody when I read her incredible memoir, The Bold World, which I highly recommend all of you get and read and love, in which she talks about her life, you know, growing up in her world. And then, but specifically, it's sort of the spark of it is when she realizes that her child, who was previously identified as a girl, you know, at a very young age, says to her, "Mom, I'm a boy." And that moment creates a kind of change in her psyche that leads her on a journey of reevaluating her entire life and the stories that she has held about gender and family and parenting. It is a gorgeous book. It is beyond this one story, even though this one story is inextricably linked to her bigger story. And so what we wanted to do was bring her in and have her really demonstrate to you how powerful this work can be when you embrace it and begin it and transform your life in a way that is healing, not just for you, but for your family, your community, and the world. right? Because the work that she has done around transgender identity and community has not only supported her son and herself and her family, but has gone out to support the larger community. And that's our dream. Our dream is for your stories to then radiate and transform the world that we're living in. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to start asking you, Jody, to talk about some of your brilliance. And what I want to start with is, you know, when we think about narrative and stories and arcs, there's always a beginning, middle, and an end in some way, even though that end could come around to the beginning. But I'm interested in, can you talk about your original story of family and parenting and what you thought it would mean, what you were told, what you were taught was the right story to hold?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, it's a big question because there's so many stories and they weren't always in conflict with each other, but they also didn't all line up. So one story that I was taught and I believed in was the story of revolution. I was raised by revolutionaries. My father did revolutionary work in the finance world. He had the first Black brokerage firm on Wall Street. My uncle's Gil Scott Heron, he did it in the creative world. My grandmother was dubbed Ms. Revolution down South for her work changing the laws during the segregated South. So when we, you know, the way I looked at family and the purpose of family was to go against the status quo and to change from what we knew was wrong to what we understood as morally right and equitable. So that was one story. And that allowed for, you would think, an open mind around all forms of change. But then this other story that was just as equally strong was a story of man and woman, cis man, cis woman, digging deep in their roles so that the struggle, so that the progress, so that the family could move. And in fact, the pathology of what the man and the woman were supposed to do, like I graduated from Spelman, my second husband graduated from Harvard. And that to me just seemed like he's African and I'm Black American. I thought that was just really going to change the world because with the education and with the cultural awareness and with him being very masculine and me being very womanly, we could do a lot. So that was another story, that the man and the woman held different positions and they needed to stay in position in order to execute change. And at some point,
No, you're rolling with
it. Everything, you know, at some point it didn't all add up. So I had to rethink everything.
What was that moment where it didn't add up? What happened?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Lily.
Slowly but surely, there were these signs. You know, it's in hindsight, you can read the writing on the wall, but in the moment, I was just seeing a lot of anger from my kid. I was seeing a lot of tension between me and husband. I was seeing myself feeling stuck, right? Like a lot of times we feel stuck as moms. We have a lot on our plate. We want to do so much in the world, yet the garlic has to be chopped and the greens have to be sauteed and you cannot miss a beat with a school schedule, right? So there was frustration, there was anger, there was arguing. And there was a feeling of like, just not of non-movement. And I still didn't get it. I thought maybe we were just busy people living in New York City, right? And then when I even didn't see the writing on the wall when my child was slapping, you know, was tearing up the pink dresses and stomping on the Mary Janes. I still didn't see it. I didn't see it when I told my husband, I don't want to be quiet around finances. I want to be just as vocal, even though I don't make as much money as you. I want to talk about it. I didn't get it all together until my kid said, Mama, I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. And then I didn't understand that to be a trans identity speaking up. I thought that was feminism. I thought, here's a girl who's noticing the differences of the world between men and women. But what it did was when Penelope said, I'm not a girl, I'm a boy, it put into question and then eventually erased every story. So then I started from scratch, rebuilding. Because if your kid is not who you think they are, then what the hell are you? You know.
And what was the first step in the rebuilding?
Listening. I just kind of shut up for a little bit. Talk about being quiet, this time being much more of a quiet time. Then when Penelope said that, revealed to me, a boy, I just got quiet. I did not have, there was a gap between what Penelope at 3 knew and what I at 40 something knew. And that I'd let that gap just sit there. So that quiet time was listening to Penelope's story. I never heard it. He said, Mama, I love you. I don't want to be you. I want to be Papa. I want a doctor to make a peanut for me. Can you help me, Mama, be a boy? So that was his story. I had never listened to it. He lived in my own house. I would have done anything for him. I hadn't listened to a story. So listening, being quiet, honoring that gap. And then I started writing, right? Of course, as we do. Memories, a flood of memories came back of me trying to, as a kid, even trying to put into place gender. A flood of memories came back around my kids. A flood of memories came back around my first husband. So just kind of engaging in the memory and then writing it down with no order necessarily. I would just be on the subway, just jotting things that came to my mind on my phone or scribbling on a piece of paper.
Yes.
I'm curious, as you found yourself listening in that space of receptivity, did you encounter resistance within yourself to the story that you had given to Penelope? And how did you move? I mean, obviously you moved through that as in writing this process that you just described to us, but what was the other work that you put into this process of encountering your own story, rewriting your own story, even as you learned that you needed to listen to Penelope's?
I almost, when I left the room that day, when Penelope said, I'm a boy, not a girl, Penelope was no longer she to me. So by the end of that 2 hours of listening, the she just rolled off and the he settled in, although I didn't necessarily share that with anyone else. But in my mind, Penelope was he, which to me marks a decision to drop that, whatever that old stuff is. And I wasn't fully even aware where I was going. I didn't know what I will help you actually meant, but I was willing. And so I think I dropped a lot of things and people and stories in that moment, almost dead to me, right? It almost took on that, like, it is this world, this stuff is dead to me if it's not going to keep my kid alive. Because the other thing Penelope said was, I don't want to live if tomorrow I'm going to look like you. So that, that instinct to save my kid was bigger than holding on to the story. I will say in the process, though, as hardcore as I was when I walked out of that room, there are things that have returned to me, people, memories that were too hard to bear. But at one point I have a softness now that is more inclusive of differences.
Yes.
Even if those differences don't sit right with me, like, some people in my family don't believe that trans identities exist. And that is a hard thing. But I have learned that these memories and these people and these truths sometimes are not going to be in agreement quite often.
Yes. There's so many important things I think that you're talking about that come up when we talk about the book, and we talk about change, that people that you moved through seemingly quite naturally, which is people often have a moment of fear, like tremendous fear, when they realize that the old story is no longer applicable and that they have to let it go. They're sort of terrified because they have no idea who they're going to be without that story. And I think that it's very interesting to think about how the love that you have for your child propels you no matter what. There's something that, there's no way you're going to abandon your child. And so the story has to go because the child cannot go, And I think when people ask us, how do you do this work? One of the things that we say is you have to be so tired of the old story. It has to be exhausted. It can no longer be functional for you. You have to want a new story. And I think it's so meaningful that you had this embodiment of the importance, this child whose life was more important than the old story. And I think if all of our readers, all the people engaging, rewriting their stories, can imagine themselves as the life they must save, their own. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, you knew you had to save your child's life, but people who need to change their story, we all have to realize we have to save our own lives, and that be our motivation. Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very difficult to understand what is actually at risk when it's not embodied outside of us.
Yeah.
And so we have this embodiment of the most profound risk you could imagine in front of you, demanding or asking that you rewrite your story. The urgency is different. We don't often recognize how much is at risk for ourselves until we've either hit rock bottom or have some kind of, embodiment outside of us that shows us, that mirrors that risk.
Yeah.
That word embodiment was perfectly said, because when Penelope said, "Mama, please help me," if I had said no, it felt in that moment like saying no to myself. I saw myself in Penelope. And people, I've heard this over and over again, you cannot live through your children. And I say, you have not been a mother then, because the separation in that moment, when there is a life or death moment, a possibility for your child, it was like saving myself. So Penelope was the most clear embodiment of how urgent it was for me to rethink that story. And in going back to what you said, Rebecca, the old story no longer served me. It had fallen apart. It was not serving me. And I only saw that when I started to write it and to spell it out, because it just felt like a busy, life. But it was actually, the systems were not serving me. It was falling apart. It had fallen apart.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I remember in the book, you talk about how that functioned in your marriage and how difficult that was to hold, as you found yourself shifting, your own gender identity shifting a little bit, and your questioning of the roles. I remember it being played out in the finances. And so it became very, very difficult. And I wonder, how did you take care of yourself in the process of that transition? You were writing, I remember in the book, you were learning everything you could. You started to really bring new information, new stories in as a way of supporting you. But how else did you take care of yourself?
I'm not sure I did very well, honestly. I mean, I think that I was angry, I was tired, I was sad, I was crying a lot, I was drinking more wine at night, I wasn't sleeping well, I was plotting, I was retracing, that when your brain is just nonstop. And I was angry all the time and in this like fighter mode, but so I wasn't feeling taken care of at all. However, what I did not stop doing was writing. I kept writing and I kept reading. I was reading like a lot of material, a lot of on-topic material, like Transgender 101 by this great author named Nick Teish. I also read a lot of James Baldwin. I also read a lot of poetry. So that, I think, was the taking care of myself, right? The mind needed to be nurtured and comforted. And I found comfort in the fact that other people had gone through struggle and revolution and change. So then it became like, this is not just, how the hell is Jody going to get out of this? Well, she's probably going to get out of it the same way like thousands and millions of people have come through change and revolution. So let's study what other people have done. I think that was the care that I gave myself, that that I wasn't alone in this story of change.
And did that process, as you gathered energy and knowledge and learning and bolstered yourself with this sense of those who've gone before, as all of that started to occupy more of your mind space, did that lead to these ideas that you now kind of have called, I really appreciate how you have sort of labeled the way that you parent, radical parenting, and this idea of radical parenting. And I'd love to hear how all of that kind of coalesced into this moment of understanding or identifying a need to think about parenting itself in a different way.
So five children. and one is adopted. Well, one came into my life when he was 18. 3 are from my second marriage and 1 is from my first marriage. We are Swiss, German, Vietnamese on one father, African from Ghana from another father, Canadian, Hispanic. So we have a lot of Black American, Southern, a lot of cultures, a lot of languages. And so when you have that much, you realize your parenting is not one size fits all. There's just no way. I can't give them all the same thing. They need so many different things. And so that was one understanding that I just, again, the system of, if you have values, you drill down as a parent, you stick with your values, and the kids will be okay. That wasn't working. And so I had to find some new ideas about parenting. I took a trip to Switzerland to visit my daughter. I went to a museum and I was looking at an exhibit on city planning. And they were talking about cities that had failed its people and cities that had done really well. New York City at one point had failed. Too much, too many people, too much congestion, and they decided to put in more highways to make it more efficient. Maybe that'll solve the problem. Well, the efficiency of the highway didn't solve the problem, it made it worse. So then New York decided to make more gardens and parks and community centers and gathering places. And I thought, this is really interesting. Efficiency is not going to be the way through parenting. It's going to be around community spaces and city planning and looking at this, like, how do we all coexist with all the differences? And so I started thinking, and so it was really from this exhibit, and then I started making our bedrooms smaller and our common spaces more dominant. A trick to doing that is putting all of the plugs for the computers and cell phones in the kitchen and in the living room. Everybody gathers there. But just it was an off concept thought about how do we live together, being very different, the same way New York City has become more successful in doing that. So radical to me means different from what we were doing, drastically different than what we were doing before. Radical means there is a dire reason why we have to change.
Yes.
And parenting, as in leadership of a team.
Yes. I mean, and that is so beautiful in so many ways and important, because you're changing the story of not just the nuclear family, the story of, the picket fence, the 2 bedrooms, the 2 kids, the dog, all of that. You're changing the story of space, of architecture, by taking that idea of civic engineering from the city and bringing it into the home. You have a real understanding that the patterns in the domestic space tell a story and create new stories. And I love, you write about it in the book, I believe, and I know that we talked about it the other day, but then you transform the space to create new rituals and new patterns of interaction. And then you actually introduced this idea of the lab, where in that common space that you have created, part of what is asked of that space and created by that space is this, well, you talk about it, is this pattern of looking at ideas and allowing certain stories, all stories, to emerge on a shared safe space, right?
Exactly. Yeah, the lab is a subversive parenting tactic that I've implemented that I think my kids are now starting to catch on to, but I started it when they were young. Whenever there's a disagreement, we lab out these big ideas or these big concepts. So the disagreement could be who gets the front seat in the car. It could be God. It could be gender identity. We sit on the floor. We sit in a circle on the floor, and the rules are simple. You can't interrupt. And whoever has the proverbial microphone can speak as long as they want. Oh, and it's not like a jousting. It's just, you have to tell your truth. Whatever is on your mind, you tell it. So like my scientist kid is 15 and he says, here's something. I respect my brother. I love him. I will always use his right pronoun. But scientifically speaking, transgender identities don't really exist, not scientifically. And Penelope is scientifically a female. And so that, he has a lot to say about that. He's 15. He thinks he has the answer. in my knowledge, I know that science has proven gender diversity, right? And in Penelope's experience, he exists. It's not a theory. So then Penelope's turn comes and he says, look, brother, I love you too. This is not a debate. I am here. I am trans. I exist. This is how God has made me. And then the scientist says, wait, hold on. God's not proven yet either. So God's not proven, trans is not proven. And so this conversation, has gone on for 8 years. Penelope on the lived experience side, Cassius on this science side, and they've not gotten any closer. In 8 years. Never have they gotten closer towards agreeing. The goal is not to agree. So the lab is just to lab out these big ideas. Because after about an hour of them sharing their thoughts, their very drastic thoughts, they go, you know what, this is so boring. Let's go play some basketball. Let's go eat some dinner. And so they have lived together for all of their lives. They will live together for, the next 10 years, perhaps 5 years. And the kid who does not believe in trans identities, I believe, will not vote against his brother when it's time. I believe will not have violence or violent reaction towards the differences between cis people and trans people. And that, to me, that's the goal. And so like this idea, I wanted to insist that the entire family support trans identities, period, no question. I tried that, it didn't work. The lab seems to be working much better to settle us in our differences, to be okay with that and not take a violent form.
Right. And also it's a way of rewriting the story of how a dominant story is not the way. I mean, we're fighting against a dominant story because we know that there are so many stories and that dominant stories have often been used to oppress us and silence us. And so going from the sense of you wanting a dominant story of full acceptance and all of that to allowing a more democratized pluralism of stories is really what we're trying to do. Always the concern about that is, well, as you said, if we allow everyone's story to exist, will one of those people, oppress the other, because we're not making them believe in the dominant story of shared humanity, et cetera, and so forth. But the idea that the stories can coexist, but we can hopefully perpetuate a human story that is the macro story, in which there is respect and empathy for everyone and all of their difference, so that when it comes time for these questions of the role of law enforcement, the role of social policy, that there's a sense of, I may not agree with that, but this story should be allowed to exist, and I am not going to support interfering in that story. So I think that's a real shift in our approach to a dominant narrative versus many narratives, with this hope that that kind of inclusivity does not lead to the oppression of someone else, and I believe in that. If we can do that, if the dominant story is about humanity and allowing everyone their freedom and dignity to self-identify and evolve as they want. Now, it's challenging, obviously, when people are doing other things, but anyway, just the general idea.
Yeah,
especially,
I think the extraordinary thing that I'm feeling as I listen to the ways that you have interrogated the stories in all parts of your life, Jody, is how you have resisted that kind of replication of systems of oppression that Rebecca was just talking about, not just by saying, okay, I choose to hear and to, honor my son's story, but also let's look at how these systems of oppression have been replicated within our public spaces, how, and then how they are encouraged within our private spaces, the space of my own home. How do I choose to rewrite the story of my home so that it is not a locus for, the oppressions of capitalism and efficiency, as you said, that, cities were designed to just be efficient, but that's not how humans work. There's no human story in that. And so how do I, your question of how do I rearrange my home to bring people together rather than make it an efficient space that keeps people apart and, in their own lane. And then again, the space of the lab does the same. It resists that replication of the system of oppression that would have us be polarized and simply occupy spaces that reinforce binaries.
Mm-hmm.
And we have this space. That's exactly why we have organized the book the way that we did, in terms of giving people the opportunity to go through each area of their life, including the home. There's a chapter on home, and say, what story am I telling to make a home? What have I prioritized in this space? What makes me feel at home, and why? And as I listen to you, I think about how many of us presume that we know what a home is, what a home means, without ever questioning why. And who told that? Who was the first person to tell that story? And was it for their own benefit, so that they could sell more houses or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think it's like, so much of this is layered, right? What you might give as a first answer to describe your family, more than likely, is only a piece of it if you go back and sit with it and journal it out and write about your family, and yourself and your children and your values. There's so many layers that it needs to be investigated, and it needs to be written on stickies. I'm writing stickies as we speak, because I'm going to put them on my wall and hold myself to them. A lot of what I was saying to Penelope, which is stand up for who you are. You say it clearly, you say it loudly, and then you just let people sit with who you are. You let them deal with it. I wasn't doing that. I was telling my 4-year-old to be this bold person, to go against the status quo, to define himself. And then I wasn't doing it myself. And so as I started to write the words down, bold world, nonconformity, I then had to look at that word, and somehow by looking at that word over and over again, it forced me to be accountable as well for that. I don't think until we write the word down and toss it around in our mouth and on our paper and in our hand do we really feel the weight of these words and how they apply to ourselves. You can do it in a diversity and inclusion class, you can pitch it to a board, you can speak it in the classroom, but how do we hold ourselves accountable? So I was very, I'll say the woman that I was 8 years ago and 5 years ago is not this woman. And that split up my marriage. One of the things that split up my marriage. I think he would have preferred me to be that woman. But after seeing Penelope go through what he did and feeling ashamed that I wasn't as bold and true to myself, then I transformed. And the woman that many people wanted is gone.
Yeah.
So, that is a reality. That when we hold ourselves accountable, there is a world shift that happens.
Yes.
Are
And
you
when you write that down, and that's one of the reasons that I so believe in memoir, that there's a magical, alchemical, psychological leap that happens when you write it down, when you write down the old way, and you see that people want you to stay in that old way, even when you are gravitating toward becoming something else. You cannot, it is like the words are propelling you forward into a different being. And you're creating the words, and the words are creating you. And slowly, it's like a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's like that part just starts to move into the past, and you are writing yourself into the future, and you cannot go back anymore. No matter how many people want you to be that person is gone. And so sometimes when I read from some of my old memoirs, I'm shocked at how I'm no longer that person. I don't even identify with that person anymore. It's like, it's unbelievable. I read about this person who was in all this pain. I don't even, it's like, who is that? And there's something so liberating in this process of writing in this way. And it's something that we so wanted to give people with this book, to be able to do that themselves in the privacy of their own personal spaces, and whether or not it turned into a memoir that they could, give to the world or not, the work would still get done. That magic, that literal writing of your own story, which is what you are so beautifully talking about.
Realize, I think that birth is
Mhm.
important, birthing. And this is what, and some people do it, some people birth other people, but this is a birth. And I think when you have birthed, my first example of that was when I birthed my first child, you couldn't tell me anything. There was a
Right.
liberation, like I had never felt that kind of power, that kind of possibility. And then when you birth creativity, you feel it again. And that is what the beauty of this book is. It is going to take you through the birthing process, which will empower you to walk through fire.
Yeah,
Essentially,
that's
yeah.
our goal. Okay, should we transition into questions or what, Lily? Do you want to?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And I selfishly am going to ask the first question, if that's okay, because I have one more question for Jody that I think may touch on something that many people feel. That's my hope, which is, Jody, for you, in this daily process of rewriting your story, when you would wake up on certain days and feel, or I guess that's part of the question, did you wake up on certain days and feel a sense of doubt or exhaustion or weariness, or that some part of you that just wanted things to not be so hard, to not have to put in so much effort into this process of rewriting your story and your family and all of that? What would you say, what was the thing that you would remember and draw on? Of course, we talked about the very embodiment of that risk with Penelope, but was there something inside of yourself, some place in yourself that you could go to and kind of gird yourself again to go back into this work?
Yes, it was hard. Yes, I felt really low. Yes, I felt exhausted. I'm not sure if I hadn't had other people, women, men in my history, I don't know if I would have made it through. So like, I think, breakthroughs are really hard. Someone said, a breakthrough is breaking. He's going to break something on you, skin, bone, right? You're going to feel the breakthrough getting to the other side. But I think that crossover, that process of crossing over for me was, I had to have the other women from my history, from my lineage, the other men from my lineage. Every day I had a collage on my wall of their images and I would embody them. I would think about my great great grandmother or about Gil and think about what, I want to be a badass poetic performer on stage like Gil today, with this beauty and this wit to my word. Or I want to be this woman who walked through the segregated South and changed it like my grandmother. I want to walk through fire today. So I would really embody the people that came before me. I don't have anything else to say other than, when we do this work, it's really hard and painful. For me, it was. When we do this work, you're not going to see where you're going to end up. You won't even know if tomorrow is going to get better. You don't know how long it's going to take.
Yeah.
But then, so if you rely on other people, like Maya Angelou said, bring everyone who came before you into each room you walk in. Bring your people, bring your auntie, bring your grandma. So that's the thing. We have to bring our people. Also, why memoirs written by queer people and women and Black people are so important to read. We have to hold on to those stories. They did it, we do it.
Yes. Are there any? I have, Stone Butch Blues is one of my favorite all-time classics. Do you have any that you want to share with people that they can read that really inspired you?
Fire Next Time.
Oh, yes.
James Baldwin. I did this thing where every time he wrote Negro, this was an exercise I did. He wrote Negro and I wrote trans on top of it. And it wasn't to compare Black folks and trans folks. It was to compare oppression. Yeah. I wanted to see if oppression in the 60s against Black people smelled, felt, played out the same as oppression in 2000 against queer people. And it does. So that
Yes.
was helpful. I was reading Baldwin while thinking about queer rights.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, I really relate to that. You know, there's something about going back to an original story and figuring out if that story can be used
Yeah.
to inform the new story, that there's a part that needs to be let go of, but there's some nugget there that has to do with your birthright that you can transmute, that you can bring forward. So, you know, my original story as a child of the civil rights movement, my father arguing at the Supreme Court, you know, on behalf of school desegregation, my mother being this African-American, you know, writer and listening to Black women's stories, you know, and I came out of that movement in Jackson, Mississippi, and was thought of as a movement child, you know, this post-racial body, a revolutionary birth. And then when they divorced, that whole narrative dissipated. And so I had to rewrite my story and move from being a tragic mulatto at that point to a magic mulatto, or whatever we want to call it. And, you know, when I really thought about what was propelling me to write this new story, it was the same genus. It was the idea that my body still was magical in some way. And that even though all of those other stories may have dissipated around, the ones that created that initial narrative, there was something that was still my birthright, that I was still someone who was going to birth a future story that was going to be of benefit, you know? And that really informed me, I think, in the same way, very similarly to what you're talking about, looking at the ancestors, you know? And
I
I've
love
been
the
saying,
remix, Magic Mulatto.
the magic mulatto, there's so many of us,
Right
you
there.
know, Obama, Moses, I mean, you know, it's a whole tradition. And I really want that as my narrative instead. You know, and I've been talking again about connecting with ancestors. And one of the things that we write about in the book and we ask people to do is revisit their relationship with the earth, you know, and the planet and you know, and I realized that I've been carrying this story that I am not connected to gardening, for instance, for growing things and having them come from the earth. Meanwhile, my mother can like look at the ground and a huge tomato will come up, you know, like the biggest eggplant you've ever seen. I mean, she can just like, you know, it's magic. But I and her mother was the same way. And yet my story has been that I don't have that gene, you know. And so part of what I'm trying to do in rewriting my story right now around this is to attempt to begin to imagine that I'm going to grow some collard greens, you know, and really bring that ancestral knowledge that has saved our people into my new story and my new relationship with the earth, which, you know, connects me not just to the earth right now, but to all of my mothers, my grandmothers, all the way back. So, you know, again, I think part of writing the new story can be and include and probably needs to return to some kernels, some fundamental truths of those original stories. But it's the deeper layers, you know.
This is the really interesting, yes, returning to that fundamental. And I relate to that. And I put it in my context. I started looking at my family that way. Like, what if this family is like building, right? If parenting or mothering is like building leadership, and then I started comparing my family to a city as an example, but also to a building. Sometimes I would look at my family as I was building a structure. What is structural that you cannot remove?
Yeah.
That's the question. And then what is aesthetic, right? That you can move around and shift. So I thought language is aesthetic, like clothing. You can change those things, but the fundamentals that you can't, the mud sill, the structure is like the person. You can't take away the person. So the person can dress and speak and emote and present in many different ways, but that person is fundamental. And I think thinking about what is fundamental, what is structural is important. And it's more, and then, you know, that will lead you to start thinking about, well, what about us is non-conforming then? I think, so there's a couple things. There's structure that cannot be fucked with.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about it, non-conformity is in more of us than not. And we have a desire to be non-conforming. And if we allow for that, we will let the person stay and acknowledge that every single one of us has this ability, this desire to be non-conforming. Just the question is, in what way?
Yes.
And not denying ourselves the imagination that would lead to nonconformity, which unfortunately we are mostly taught to do from the time that we are very, very young, which is, you know, the radical parenting in your choice to simply listen to Penelope that day, in and of itself was an act of nonconformity.
I love this idea though, Jody. I think it's so important that all of us, within all of us, I do believe that there is a desire to nonconform, to be that liberation is in us. We want to develop into ourselves. We see that in our adolescents when they start to individuate. You know, it's a natural, you know, part. And then when it is silenced, when it is squashed, it's something that is killed. You know, it's the dream deferred. But even again and again at a deep level, we all want to be free. You know, we don't want to conform. What is conformity? It's the kind of death. So I think that's really a beautiful contribution. And I see all of these questions here that I didn't see.
I like the one that just says, how do you write? There was one in there that's
oh my goodness.
From someone who's early in his or her studying, and the question, I can't find it now, but was like, how do you write?
Yeah, I saw that as well, and I don't see it anymore.
I see it. That's Lisa Barr. I'm a first semester MFA and want to know, how do you write? I still use pen paper because it feels better to me. What is your process and what advice could you give to a Black 56-year-old first semester MFA student?
You take that one, Rebecca. You've written so much.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm so happy that you're writing. I mean, you're a first semester MFA student, and go ahead on with your bad self. That's fantastic. How do you write? So I think you want to know. So I now write on the computer. My wife was saying, but you have this dent in your finger, and you used to talk about how you wrote by hand and longhand all the time. And I do remember that early time when I did write a lot with a pen. But now I write on the computer. It's easier for me, and also I find that I can keep up with my thoughts. It's a little bit quicker. But I do miss the sort of purity that comes from writing with a pen, you know, onto paper. My mother writes all of her books longhand, which is amazing to me. I can't even imagine doing it. But I think it really contributes to a kind of authenticity and potency. But I think you just have to find your own way, you know, find what feels better to you, and find what sounds more true when you read it back. You know, that will really tell you what's better for you, you know. So I hope that helps.
I write so many different ways. I write, one thing I try to capture is to take the moment of inspiration. So if I found myself wanting to put my thoughts down on the subway. Mm-hmm. So a lot of my writing was done on my iPhone in the notes section on the subway A train, because that's where the words came. Another chunk of my writing is actually into a recorder. Yes. So I get stuck writing, trying to sound smart, I just speak, and then I transcribe those words. So that's a big part of my writing, is talking. And then I rarely write with my pen anymore because my fingers are so stupid. My thumbs are good in texting, but my grip is not so good anymore. So I don't find it easy to write with a pen. So I'm either typing on a laptop, texting, you know, on my phone with notes, or speaking. That works for me.
Except when we're journaling and writing in What's Your Story, which is when we're using a pen.
Oh, sorry. No, actually, you're right. I do stickies all the time. I am writing. Yeah. But it's very scribbly. And that, you know, is funny because as a writer, you think you're supposed to have these eloquent, you know, long form ideas that develop into these beautiful stories. And sometimes it's like just scratches of ideas on paper, which is journaling sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah. I think our lovely moderator was just saying we have time for one more question. So there's a question here from Faith. How is What's Your Story structured, and how do you advise using it? And I'm happy to answer that for you. So This book is structured both in chapters that are thematic, that take you through the general sort of flow of a day. Everything from waking up and encountering your own mind, being in your body, being with people, going to work, facing the screen, so looking at how we relate to technology, going outside. It's the chapter Rebecca mentioned of our relationship, our connection to the earth, being in community, coming home, twilight, which is an exploration of mortality and really looking at the broader life that we have lived. And then there are also, in addition to those chapters, we've created for you 5 different themes that you can also use to explore the book. So these colors go through the book. The pages are color coded. So as you go through, you can choose different themes to explore. And those themes are creativity and self-expression, self-care, activism and politics, spirituality, and grief, loss, and the work of healing. So it's really for you to explore any way that you want. As Jody was saying, you could open it up anywhere and hopefully tap into a question that brings up some deep thought or story for you, that you have been holding on to and are ready to interrogate and let go and rewrite. But it's for you. And I saw a question also around, for a first-time journaler, like what are your tips? And I would say don't enter into this with any preconceived idea of how it needs to be or how it needs to go for yourself. We've created this space as a way for you to have as much freedom as you can in exploring the stories that you carry, and in rewriting those stories. And so hopefully we've done a lot of the heavy lifting in that regard for you, so that you can just enter into the stream of the work and be free.
Yay, freedom. And I want to give a quick shout out to that last question before we run off, because Faith Adele is the person who asked the question, and she's written a beautiful memoir herself, Meeting Faith, The Forest Journals of a Black Buddhist Nun. And I think that book I read many years ago as I was writing one of my memoirs, and was very inspired by her. And she's someone who has really also changed her story by taking a different path. So thank you, Faith. I'm so glad to see you here. And I hope you all check out her book as well. So I know we don't have a lot of time.
Parting word?
Yes, parting word. Yes, you can take us out.
One of these comments was, how do we tell our truth without burning down the house, without destroying everything around us? And I think journaling, this is not an expose, right? This is journaling, which will take you to the most graceful, truthful experience. And as we journal, the words come and we can express our truth without destroying lives, without burning down the house. That is not the goal. The goal is to be the most inviting for change around us. And I think the journaling part has to be a part of the untelling and the retelling. Otherwise, it does become problematic. And this is what we're talking about, is a beautiful exploration.
Perfect. Beautiful exploration. Yeah. Bold world. What's your story? Thank you so much for coming.
Say journaling gives us space and structure to explore. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So take all the space you can take. It's your space. It's your birthright. And we always say, our hope for you is that you are always able to write your own story. And we will see you hopefully soon. All right.
Thank you.
Be safe and be well. Thank you so much, Jody. We love you. We're so grateful you were here. Okay.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Questions that we did not get to, feel free to bring them to us on Instagram or social media, or wherever. We would love to answer your questions.
Yes. So at what's your story now is our Insta handle.
Want it now.
Okay. Bye-bye, y'all.